So we continue this morning with our theme from last week and the few weeks before that of challenging readings from Romans that are tough to give sermons on. This morning I would like you to think about someone that you care about who is not Christian. At some points in Western Christian history, this would have been challenging for a lot of churchgoers because many of them would have been surrounded by people who all went to the same church on Sunday and who had been brought up to believe very similar things. But I suspect that today, most of you know plenty of people who aren't Christian. And they might be close friends, they might be family members, maybe they follow another religious tradition, or maybe they're agnostic or atheist. And perhaps those differences in belief have caused some stress, or perhaps there's full mutual acceptance of each other's beliefs, which is great. Whatever the situation, I'd like you to try to think of someone and keep them in the back of your mind today. In today's psalm, we are reminded of some of what we talked about last week, in particular, God's reiterated promise and covenant with Jacob. And the language here used for the covenant family of God is chosen ones. And then this continues in our reading from Romans because we have multiple references to some people being predestined, to the idea of the elect, the people chosen as the elect people of God. Predestination and election, these are touch points of Reformed theology, and they are things that God knows I have struggled with. There are some of the things that I want to say, can we just forget this whole idea about the elect? I would like to be like Thomas Jefferson cutting particular parts out of my Bible, and this might be one of those passages. Because the way that most of us have been taught to understand it, this can be one of the most divisive ideas in the entire Bible. Either you're one of the elect, you're one of us, or you're not. Sorry about that. But hey, isn't it great to be one of us? One of the chosen people? Honestly, I think there are people who like the idea of the elect because they secretly like the idea of being chosen, of getting to be in the club. And they're not necessarily thinking about what that implies for everybody else. And also, this idea can drive away non-Christians. Not only that, I suspect that for a lot of people who have left the church recently, when we hear about people who are now spiritual but not religious, or who are deconstructing their faith, or ex-evangelicals, a lot of these people may have found this to be a significant motivating factor. They know people who aren't Christian. They know those people to be good people. They believe good things about those people. And they find themselves saying, I don't know if I can stay in a faith that puts them on the outside. And I know that I've had times that I've considered leaving the faith because of how exclusionary teachings like this can be around predestination and the elect. Because we're not as insular as Christians have been in the past. We all know people who aren't Christian. So what if there's another way to think about all this? About predestination, about chosenness, about election. I'm going to borrow heavily here from work by a professor of mine, Suzanne McDonald, who wrote an entire doctoral thesis about this, which has been published as a book. It's pretty dense, and it's not what I would call a beach read. So I have written a paper myself on that where I took all of this material and condensed it down here, and now I'm going to try to give you the few paragraph version of that. If you want to talk more about it, or if you want to read my paper, or if you want to read her dissertation, let me know, because I can get you any of those. She uses the phrase, when she talks about election and about predestination, as election to representation, which is to say that any chosen or elect status received from God by a people is part of a covenant relationship that is actually for the sake of the other. The covenant isn't just about the covenanted people, it's for the people who are not part of the covenant. And when we talk about predestination or the elect, we're talking about covenant. So the New Testament references to elect, the Old Testament references to the covenant, we're talking about the same peoples. We're talking about God's chosen family on earth, as it were. So she explains that in the Old Testament, all of humanity is originally intended to serve as ministers for the rest of creation. And in that role, representing all of creation to God and being the representative of God to all of creation. That's the purpose of humanity. And by 3 chapters into Genesis, we've made a mess of things. So God eventually selects Israel, or elects Israel, to take on that role. Israel is to be a nation of priests. Israel is to be the mediator and intercessor for the other nations, partly through its interaction with the other nations, and partly by representing the whole of humanity back to God. As the chosen people, Israel stands between God and the rest of humanity in a way of mutual representation. Professor McDonald then discusses how Christ comes to take on that role for Israel as well as for the rest of humanity, because Israel also made a bit of a mess of things in the Old Testament. So Jesus takes on that space of becoming the newly elect one, in this case, who stands between God and humanity. Again, this position is not fundamentally for the sake of Jesus. This is for the sake of everybody else. And after Pentecost, God elects the Christian community to take this role of representing humanity to God and representing God back to humanity. And the reason for this is that she traces a thread throughout the Old Testament and New that God's desire to bless humanity, and indeed all of creation, is always brought about through a particular people. The chosen people, such as they are called, whether that's Israel of the Old Testament or Christians today, exist for the sake of being a blessing to others. And there is a key idea here that I really want to highlight. This way of thinking about election and predestination separates those concepts from the concept of salvation. So let me put that another way. If McDonald's interpretation is correct, and I do believe that it is scripturally and logically sound, then becoming Christian and being elected into the chosen people is actually about stepping into a role that is for other people, and it's not about whether or not you're saved. Rather, it's about becoming a channel of blessing, a channel of God's blessing to others. And in this view, election and salvation are actually independent categories. So that means there is ample hope for people who are not part of the elect, not part of the church, to be blessed and saved after all. This offers a perspective that is actually in line with historical Christianity, especially early Christianity. And yet it's also progressive by modern standards in saying that the doors to God are open to all people, precisely because of the blessings that flow through the elect people. And I think there's some things that the elect can do, or that the chosen people can do, that don't come easily to other people. An example of that would be today's psalm, which I really like Eugene Peterson's rendition of parts of this in the Message version of the Bible. Part of that reads, "Keep your eyes open for God. Watch for his works. Be alert for signs of his presence. And that's not something everybody can do easily. But as children in the family of God, through the covenant, we can do that. And we can do that for others. We can remain open, and we can share about the works and the signs that we notice. Now, some may point out that God is already in everyone, not just Christians. So why would anyone need somebody else to represent them to God or to represent God to them in the first place? And I think that's a valid point, because the Christian church accepts the Jewish tradition that every person, Christian, Jewish, every human, whatever their belief system is, whatever their tradition is, bears the image of God. So everyone, even if they are not part of the elect, has that image. But is everyone equally in touch with the image of God in them? Is every person equally open to hearing the voice of the Creator God speaking quietly to them from within? Is every person speaking directly to God, who is their parent, and is every person trying to build that relationship? Or have some people maybe disconnected themselves from their own image of God? Have some people, willfully or not, stopped listening for God's voice? And honestly, not just people outside the church. I think there are people inside the church who are nominally Christian who have lost touch with the element of God that is within them. So some people may have lost sight of their inherent capacity for connecting to the divine. Maybe it's because they're too caught up in a scientific materialist worldview to be able to still believe in God. Maybe they're carrying too much anger because of a significant loss in their life to be able to talk to God. Or maybe they've been too traumatized by religion or by the church to remain open to receiving God's love in a direct way. So that leaves a space for those of us who can stand in representation of God to them and of them to God. So how do we do that? How do we represent others to God? Well, simply pray for them, certainly. But I think more than that, carry those people in your heart. Carry their imperfections and their brokenness with your own imperfections, your own brokenness. Hold them before God with you and be a representation of them to God in that way. And how do we represent God to others? On one level, I think we can do that simply by being noticeably Christian. It was said that Israel was a blessing to other nations in part just by being the nation of God, just by being a people who said, there's God and we worship God, and you can see that relationship, and that is a way of representing God to others. Other people who don't share our beliefs can see us and hear us and think to themselves, well, I may not believe in this God character, but they certainly do. So just by living our lives as believers and remaining open to noticing God's actions, we are offering witness to the idea of a living God, the idea of a divine creator who is still with us and who is in us, and in whom all of creation lives and moves and has its being. But there's another level too. We can represent God to others by being a blessing to them. It's the same way that we are known or said to be known as Christians in the first place, which is by our love. So, The atheist academic that you know, love them. The self-absorbed investment banker who stopped worrying about what God might think about his actions long ago, love him. The addict who can't hear the still small voice over the crashing need for the next fix, love them. The transgender person who was pushed out of the faith by people who didn't understand, love them. And sometimes loving might mean providing for someone's material needs. And sometimes it may be rejoicing with them as they rejoice, or weeping with them as they weep. And sometimes it might just be being with them as a comforting presence in shared brokenness. So think back to my opening here. Do you still have that person in mind? What if being predestined or elect isn't about you being on the inside and that person being on the outside? What if it's not about us being saved in an exclusionary way? What if this covenant family is about being a blessing to those people, representing God to them because God is love? Amen.